The morning Charlotte Cooper made 2 plates of food was the morning she finally understood that grief does not ask permission before it loosens its grip on you. The year was 1873, and the town of Redemption Creek, Texas sat baked and dusty beneath a sky so wide and blue it looked like God had stretched it flat on purpose, just to remind everyone below how small they truly were. The town had sprung up along a limestone creek bed that ran clear in the spring and dwindled to nothing by August, and it had the particular character of most West Texas settlements in that era: stubborn, sun-scorched, and full of people who had come from somewhere else, and were trying very hard to convince themselves this was where they belonged. Charlotte Cooper was 31 years old, and she had the kind of quiet beauty that does not announce itself, but rather settles over a room the way late afternoon light does, gradually, and then all at once. Her hair was dark brown and threaded at the temples with the first silver that grief tends to put there faster than age does. Her eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, that particular shade of gray-green that shifts depending on what the light is doing. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and she carried herself with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who had learned that if she did not hold herself upright, she might simply stop doing so altogether. Her husband, Thomas Cooper, had died the previous winter. He had been a good man in the uncomplicated way that some men are: steady, gentle, given to long silences that were not uncomfortable, and possessed of a laugh that arrived slow but meant something when it did. He had run a modest cattle operation on 160 acres south of town, and he had been returning from Abilene with a small herd he'd sold when his horse threw him on the frozen ground just outside of Redemption Creek. The cold had done the rest. He was 34 years old, and he had been married to Charlotte for 7 years, and they had no children, though not for want of trying or wanting, and his death left her with the land, the house, a small account at the Redemption Creek Bank and Trust, and the particular silence that only comes when the person who made the most noise in a place is gone forever. She had managed, as women in that time and place were required to manage, which is to say she had done it without complaining about it where anyone could hear her. She had learned to fix the fence line herself, learned to negotiate with the cattle buyers herself, learned to sit at a table built for 2 and eat her supper without looking at the chair across from her. She had neighbors who helped when they could, and a woman named Mee Dillard who came twice a week to help with washing and sometimes just to sit with her, and she had gotten through the winter and the spring and most of the summer in this manner, intact if not entirely whole. It was a Thursday morning in late August when it happened. She had woken early, as she always did, because the heat came fast in Texas, and the cool hours before sunrise were not to be wasted. She had started the fire in the cast iron stove, which she had gotten competent at, though she still occasionally burned her wrist on the iron door. She had gone out to the well and drawn water. She had come back inside, and she had begun to make breakfast the way she always had, the way she had made it for 7 years of mornings, and she had not fully woken up to what she was doing until the second plate was set and the second cup of coffee was poured. She stood in the middle of her kitchen with the frying pan still in her hand and the smell of salt pork in the air and 2 plates of food on the table, and the second chair pulled out slightly, the way Thomas used to pull it, and she did not move for a very long time. It was not the first time grief had ambushed her, but there is a particular kind of ambush that comes not from pain but from muscle memory, from the body remembering love before the mind catches up, and that kind is different. It does not make you cry, exactly. It makes you stand very still, as if any movement might shatter something that you have been carefully holding together. She stood there until the food was cold. And then she covered both plates with a cloth, because she could not eat and she could not throw it out either, and she went and sat on the front porch and watched the road that ran past her property and let the morning come fully up around her. That was how she was sitting when the stranger rode in. He came from the west, which was the direction people came from when they were heading toward the mountains, and were not yet ready to admit they'd have to stop somewhere. He was riding a roan horse that was sound enough, but had clearly put in a hard week's worth of miles, and he himself had the look of a man who had been traveling without particular destination, which is a different kind of tired than the kind you get from working. He was tall in the saddle, lean in the way that working men are lean rather than the way hungry men are, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 5 days and dark hair beneath a battered hat that had once been black but had faded to the color of deep shadow. He wore a plain cotton shirt, dust-stained and dungarees, and his boots were good quality though they'd seen hard use. He pulled the roan up when he saw her on the porch, which was a polite thing to do, and he took off his hat, which was a politer thing still. "Morning, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who had learned there was rarely a reason to raise it. "I don't suppose you'd know if there's a place in town where a man could get work. Any kind of work. I'm handy with horses and with fence and with most things that need fixing." Charlotte looked at him for a moment with the particular measuring look that a woman living alone learns to develop, not suspicious exactly, but careful, the way you are careful about a dog you do not know before you decide whether it is friendly. He sat his horse quietly and did not fidget and met her eyes directly without being aggressive about it. "Town's another 2 miles east," she said. "But if you're looking for work, I have work here if you're willing. The south fence line needs a good week of attention, and I've got a barn roof that started to go in the spring and I haven't got to it." She did not entirely know why she offered it. She thought later that it might have been the 2 plates of food still sitting cold on her kitchen table, and the particular feeling of a morning that had started wrong and needed to be redirected. "I'd be grateful for that," the man said, and there was something in the way he said it, quietly, without excess, that told her he meant exactly what he said and nothing more than what he said. "Name's Lewis Rhodes. Charlotte Cooper," she said. "You can put your horse in the barn. Water pumps on the south side. I'll show you where the tools are." That was how it started, without ceremony, the way most important things in that part of the world and that part of time started, with practicality first, and everything else figuring itself out afterward. Lewis Rhodes was 34 years old, though Charlotte did not learn this for several days. He was from Missouri originally, from a small farming town outside of Hannibal that he had left at 17 to join his uncle's cattle drive, and he had been moving more or less steadily westward ever since, which was not an unusual trajectory for a man of his time. He had worked cattle drives, freighting operations, a brief and unsatisfying stint doing survey work for the railroad before it became clear to him that what the railroad was doing to the land and the people on it was not something he could be comfortable helping along. He had worked a horse ranch in New Mexico for 2 years before the owner died, and the property was sold to a land company out of St. Louis, and since then he had been drifting, not unhappily but not happily either, in the way a man drifts when he is looking for something he cannot yet name clearly enough to look for it directly. He was not a complicated man in the theatrical sense. He did not carry obvious wounds on the outside or speak with dramatic weight about his past, but he was thoughtful in a way that revealed itself gradually. In the careful way he treated the roan horse, in the way he listened when someone spoke rather than waiting for his turn to talk, in the small competences he showed throughout that first day of work, each task done fully before moving to the next one. Charlotte watched him from a distance that first day, as was sensible and appropriate, and she decided by evening that she had made an acceptable judgment call in offering him the work. He had cleared nearly a quarter-mile of the south fence line, pulling old wire and rotten posts with the methodical efficiency of a man who understood that there was no shortcut in that kind of work. He had not approached the house except when she had called him for the noon meal, which she had prepared with the particular self-consciousness of a woman who knows she is being seen doing something domestic, though she recovered from this self-consciousness quickly enough. She set his plate across the table from her own. She noticed that she had done it without thinking, and she noticed that she did not take it back. "You been on this place long?" Lewis asked, eating with the unhurried appetite of a working man and the manners of a man who had been raised by someone who cared about such things. 7 years, Charlotte said. My husband and I came out from Tennessee. He died last winter. She said it plainly because she had found that plain was better than complicated when it came to that particular piece of information. Complicated left room for pity, and she had gotten enough of that to last her. Lewis nodded. He did not say he was sorry, which surprised her slightly and then impressed her, because she had heard sorry so many times in the past 8 months that the word had started to feel like a stone wall you had to walk into again and again. Instead he said, "That's a hard thing to carry through a winter." "It is," she agreed. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her too. He slept in the barn that first night, on a bedroll in the empty stall, and she went to sleep in the house listening to the ordinary sounds of another person on the property, the horse moving in its stall, the creak of the barn door in the wind, and she realized that she had missed those sounds more than she had known. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt, to Charlotte's cautious surprise, natural. Lewis worked hard and without complaint, and the south fence line came along steadily, and he began to assess the barn roof, and came to her one afternoon with a list of materials he would need, which he had written out in a clear, careful hand that told her he had been schooled somewhere along the way. She paid him a fair wage from the household account, which she had calculated could sustain 2 people for approximately 8 months, which seemed like enough of a runway for the immediate work to get done. She did not tell him this. She told herself she was thinking practically. By the end of the first week, they had developed a domestic rhythm that neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would have required acknowledging it. She cooked breakfast and the noon meal. He ate without fuss and said genuinely appreciative things about the food that were specific rather than polite. He noted once that she used a different herb in the cornbread than he had tasted anywhere else, and she told him it was dried sage she kept from her own garden, and he nodded as if this explained something important. In the evenings she sometimes sat on the front porch, and he sometimes sat on the step below, and they talked about the property or the weather or the particular gossip of Redemption Creek that filtered out from town with me Dillard twice a week. Charlotte went to town on Friday to collect supplies and to stop at the bank, and she ran into me Dillard outside Caldwell's Dry Goods, and me gave her the particular look that women give each other when they have heard a thing and are waiting to see if the other person is going to bring it up first. "I heard you've taken on a hired man," me said. "I've taken on someone to fix the fence in the barn," Charlotte said, "which needed to be done." "I heard he's staying in the barn." "He is," Charlotte said, "which is where hired men stay." Me Dillard had been Charlotte's friend since Charlotte arrived in Redemption Creek, and she was a practical woman, which meant she knew when to press and when to let a thing alone. She let it alone, but Charlotte noticed the look she gave her, not disapproving exactly, more the look of a woman who has seen something beginning and is deciding whether to say so. "He seems capable," was all me said. "He is," Charlotte agreed, and went into the dry goods store. She bought an extra pound of coffee, which she told herself was simply prudent housekeeping. It was the second week when something shifted, in the way that shifts happen out on the open land slowly, and then all at once, like weather coming in. She had ridden out with him to look at the back section of the property, which had a water situation that needed addressing if the fall was going to go smoothly. A small stock tank that had partially silted up and needed to be cleared before the autumn brought cattle buyers around. They rode side by side, which she had not done with another person since Thomas, and the parallel motion of riding together had a particular intimacy that she noticed without meaning to. Lewis had been looking at the land with the steady, assessing attention he brought to everything, and then he pulled the roan up at the high point of the property where you could see the whole spread laid out below, the house small and white in the distance, the ribbon of the dry creek bed that crossed the southwest corner, the long flat reach of Texas stretching out beyond it in every direction. "This is good land," he said, "not sentimental about it, just true." "I know it," Charlotte said. Hard to hold it alone. I know that too, she said. He looked at her then, the first time she felt him look at her directly and fully, not as an employer or a stranger or even simply as a woman, but as a person whom he was seeing specifically. She felt it in a way that was not unpleasant and not entirely comfortable, the way warmth feels when you have been cold for a long time. "What are you planning to do with it?" he asked. "Hold it," she said simply. "It's mine. Thomas and I built it. I'm not going to let it go." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's a good reason." They rode back in the kind of silence that comes after something real has been said, and she spent the rest of that afternoon turning the conversation over in her mind with the careful attention you give something that you are not sure yet what it means. The incident with the cattle buyers came in the third week, and it showed her something about Lewis Rhodes that she had not yet fully seen. Two men named Garrett and Fowler had been coming around the Redemption Creek area for the past month, representing a land acquisition company out of Fort Worth that had been quietly purchasing or pressuring smaller operations into selling at low prices. This was not uncommon in 1873 Texas. The big land consolidations were beginning. Money from the east was moving into the cattle country, and smaller ranchers were being squeezed. Charlotte had received a letter from them the previous month offering her what she knew was considerably below market value for the property, and she had not responded. They rode in on a Tuesday morning while Charlotte was in the garden and Lewis was on the barn roof. They were polished men in expensive dusters, which is to say they were the kind of men who had money and used it to suggest authority they had not necessarily earned. "Mrs. Cooper," the one named Garrett said, not dismounting. "We've come about the offer we put in writing." "I received your letter," Charlotte said. She did not set down her trowel. "I didn't respond because I don't have anything to say. I'm not interested in selling." "Ma'am, the value we've offered is generous given the market situation." "I know what the market situation is," Charlotte said, "and I know what this land is worth, and those two things don't match your number. So no." Garrett exchanged a look with Fowler that Charlotte recognized as the particular look men exchange when they are deciding to proceed, as if what a woman has said does not need to be taken seriously. "Perhaps if you thought about it," Fowler began. "A woman alone on this much land," she said. "No." The voice came from above. They all looked up. Lewis was standing on the barn roof with his hammer still in his hand, looking down with the kind of calm that is significantly more unnerving than agitation. "And she said it clearly," Lewis continued, "so I'd ride on." There was a pause in which the two men recalibrated. Lewis Rhodes was not a large man in the theatrical way, but he had the particular quality of complete stillness that on a rooftop with a hammer in hand carries its own variety of weight. Garrett cleared his throat. "We'll be in contact again, Mrs. Cooper." "Don't bother," she said. They rode out, and she looked up at Lewis, who had already returned to the roof and the rhythm of his hammering, and she felt something that she was not yet ready to name settle further into place inside her chest. That evening she brought him a cup of coffee out to the barn step, which she had not done before, and he accepted it with the same quiet courtesy he brought to everything, and they sat in the long amber dusk of a Texas August evening, and she said, "Thank you for that." "You handled it," he said. "I just clarified it." "Still," she said. He looked at her sideways with an expression that she was beginning to learn, a slight gathering of the brows, a stillness at the corner of his mouth, which in him served the purpose that a smile serves in more expressive men. It meant he was pleased or moved or both. "You're tougher than you think you are," he said. "I know how tough I am," she said. "I just appreciate not having to be it alone." She had not meant to say that. She heard it come out, and she felt the air change slightly, the way it changes when something true is spoken aloud in a quiet place. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I understand that." She went inside shortly after, because the conversation had reached the edge of something she was not yet ready to step over, and she lay in bed that night listening to the sounds of the property, the horse, the wind, the occasional soft sound of movement, and she thought about Thomas, which she did. She thought about how he had been, and how the absence of him had been, and she thought about the 2 plates she had made that morning 3 weeks ago, and the feeling that had gone through her when she stood looking at them. She thought about grief, and whether it was a betrayal of grief to begin to feel something else, and she decided carefully, honestly, in the dark, that it was not. That Thomas would not have wanted her to stand still forever holding 2 cold plates, that he had loved her too well for that. She fell asleep with the decision in her, which was not about Lewis specifically, not yet, but was about herself, about being willing. The following Sunday she went to the church in Redemption Creek, which she did most Sundays as much for community as for spiritual sustenance, and Lewis remained at the property because he had not been a church-going man in some time, and she did not press it. But when she came back, she found that he had tidied the kitchen, not the domestic tidying of someone performing helpfulness, but the careful, competent tidying of someone who had looked at a space and seen what needed doing and done it. And there was fresh water in the basin, and the fire laid ready in the stove. She stood in the kitchen looking at it and felt something move through her that was specific and undeniable. She made supper that evening and called him in, and the conversation over the meal was the longest they had had, ranging across topics with a naturalness that surprised her: his time in Missouri, the cattle drives, the things he had seen in New Mexico that he described with a spare, precise language that made her see them clearly. She told him about Tennessee, about the farm she had grown up on, about how she and Thomas had decided to come west and how frightening and astonishing that journey had been, and how the land out here had gotten into her in a way she had not expected. "Some places do that," Lewis said. "Is there a place that's done that to you?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to questions that deserved it. "Not yet," he said. And then, not elaborating, he looked at his coffee cup with a thoughtful expression. She understood what he did not say, and she did not press it. September came, and with it the first cooling of the air that made Texas livable again, and the barn roof was finished and the fence line was done and the stock tank was cleared, and Charlotte was aware that the original work was largely accomplished. She had not brought this up. He had not brought it up either. She told herself this was mutual avoidance of a practical conversation and not something more, but she had been honest with herself for 31 years, and she knew that was not entirely true. Me Dillard came on Tuesday and caught them having coffee on the porch and greeted Lewis with the brisk friendliness she used for people she was still deciding about, and afterward inside, while Charlotte was putting up preserves, she said without preamble, "You like him." "He's good company," Charlotte said. "Charlotte Ann Cooper," Me said. Charlotte put down the jar she was holding. "I don't know what I feel," she said. "I know that I am comfortable when he is here in a way I haven't been comfortable in a long time. I know that I find reasons to sit with him in the evening. I know that when I think about the work being finished, I feel something that is not what I feel when a practical problem is resolved." "That sounds fairly clear," Me observed. "It's been barely a year since Thomas," Charlotte said. "I know it has," Me said more gently. "And I'm not going to tell you what to do or when to feel it. I'm just saying what I see." Charlotte finished putting up the preserves and did not say anything more about it. But that evening, she sat with Lewis on the porch longer than usual, and the conversation wandered all over the landscape of who they were, and she listened to the particular low cadence of his voice, and the precise way he chose his words, not educated in the formal sense, but careful, like a man who has thought a great deal without the scaffolding of schooling to organize it and has had to build the structure himself. And she decided that whatever she felt was her own business to name in her own time. It was the first day of October when the fence on the north section came down in a wind event that was characteristic of the Texas panhandle air that sometimes blasted south without warning, and she and Lewis rode out together to assess it, and she lost her hat in the wind, and he caught it, reached out from the saddle as it sailed past him and caught it cleanly, and he handed it back to her, and they were very close in that moment, their horses nearly touching. And she looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them looked away immediately. "You have good reflexes," she said, Only for things worth catching, he said. She put the hat back on her head and looked away at the downed fence, and her heart was doing something she had not felt it do in over a year, which was making itself known. They fixed the fence over 2 days and worked side by side in the cooling October air, and the conversation that wound between them as they worked had the easy quality of two people who have stopped performing ease and have arrived at the real thing. He told her about a horse he had loved once, a gray quarter horse he'd had in New Mexico that had died of colic, and the plain sadness in the way he said it moved her because it was uncomplicated sadness, the kind that does not pretend to be about anything other than what it is about. She told him about the first winter after Thomas died, and she told it without softening it, and he listened the way he always listened, fully, without rushing her to the end of the hard part. The hardest thing, she said, pulling wire through a new post, was the silence, not the quiet. I have always liked quiet, but the silence where a person used to be, that's a different animal entirely. I imagine it is, he said. Have you ever, she paused, not knowing quite how to ask it. Have I ever lost someone, he said. Yes. My mother, he said. When I was 22, she was the only family I was close to. My father and I were never on good terms. He pulled the wire taut and secured it with the particular efficiency he brought to physical work. The house I grew up in was the quietest place I've ever been after she died, not because he was loud before, but because she had been present, in a way that filled the space. Charlotte nodded. She understood exactly what he meant. After that, I didn't stay in one place long enough to have the silence set in anywhere else, he said. She looked at him. Is that why you've been moving? He looked back at her, and the honesty that passed between them in that look was the most intimate thing that had happened between them, more than the caught hat or the shared mornings or the coffee in the evening. Probably, he said. Yes. She did not say that he did not have to keep moving. She did not say it because she was not sure yet whether she had the right to say it, and she did not say things she was not sure of. But she thought it, and she let herself think it, and that was its own kind of forward motion. October deepened, and the light changed the way it changes in Texas in the fall, going from the flat blaze of summer to something lower and more golden, a slant of sun that turns the dry grass amber and makes even the scrub look elegant. Charlotte found herself looking at the property through the eyes of someone seeing it freshly, which she had not done in a year, and she realized that what she was doing was seeing it the way Lewis saw it, with appreciation instead of endurance. He had taken to bringing her wildflowers when he rode the fence line, which was a thing he did 3 times a week as part of his routine maintenance of the property. Not bouquets, nothing theatrical, but a single stem or two of whatever was blooming at the edge of the property, late Indian paintbrush, dried grasses with their seed heads still attached, once a small cluster of late-season prairie clover. He left them on the kitchen windowsill without comment, and she arranged them without comment, and neither of them mentioned this exchange, which was why it meant as much as it did. On a Tuesday evening in mid-October, she made a peach pie, which she had not made in over a year because it had been Thomas's particular favorite, and she had not been able to bring herself to make it for herself alone. She made it now without thinking about why, or she thought about why and did it anyway, which is perhaps the same thing. She set it on the table when Lewis came in from evening chores, and she watched his face when he saw it. "Pie," he said, and his expression had the kind of uncomplicated pleasure that people who have spent time without small pleasures show when they encounter them. "Sit down," she said. She cut 2 pieces and they ate them with the last of the evening coming through the kitchen window, and Lewis said it was the best pie he had eaten since his mother had been alive, and he said it in the way of a person producing a true recollection rather than a compliment, and she felt it land in her chest warm and certain. "I haven't made it in a year," she said. He looked at her. "Why now?" She held his gaze. "I felt like it was time to start making things I like again." The silence that followed was the kind that contains a great deal, and they both sat in it without rushing it, and then he said, "I'm glad," and the word came out low and careful in the way of a man who is being very deliberate about it. She said good night shortly after and went inside, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment in the lamplight with both their dishes on the table and the evening still warm in the room, and she felt the rightness of it, not a replacement, not a forgetting, but a rightness of its own particular kind, the way a new season is not a betrayal of the one before it. She thought of Thomas, and she was glad that she had loved him, and she thought that he would have been quietly glad for her in the way he was quietly glad for things, and she let herself believe that. The following Thursday she rode to town to handle some correspondence at the bank, and she stopped at Elias Crawford's office, which served Redemption Creek simultaneously as a land records office, a notary, and the nearest thing the town had to a lawyer. She had some documents to have witnessed routine estate matters she had been putting off, and Elias Crawford, who was a meticulous man of 60 with spectacles and an impressive gray mustache, handled them with the precision he brought to everything. "You seem well, Charlotte," he said, which was his version of a personal observation. "I am better," she said, which was more accurate than well. He looked at her over his spectacles in the way old men look at young women when they have noticed something. "I heard you've got a man working the place." "I do," she said. "Name's Lewis Rhodes. He's done good work worth keeping on." Elias asked, with the particular careful neutrality of a man asking a thing he is genuinely curious about. Charlotte signed the documents he had put in front of her. "I expect so," she said. She rode home with that sentence in her ears, the full weight of it more than it appeared on the surface. That evening she asked him directly. She had always preferred directness, having found that indirectness mostly just extended the time you spent uncomfortable before arriving at the thing you were going to arrive at anyway. They were sitting on the porch in the last warmth of October, and she said, "The original work is done. The fence is good and the barn roof is sound and the tank is clear. But the south pasture needs work before spring if I want to run more cattle, and there's the east section that needs clearing, and the truth of it is that this property is too much for one person, which I knew before and was trying not to admit." Lewis looked at his boots. "I can stay on," he said, "if that's what you're asking." "I'm asking if you want to," she said, "not just if you're willing." He looked at her then, and the honesty she had come to expect from him was there in full. "Charlotte," he said, "I've been thinking about leaving for 2 weeks and not been able to make myself do it, and it is not because the roof isn't finished." The air between them held the words for a moment. "Then stay," she said. "All right," he said. They sat in the quiet for another hour, and when she went in she paused at the door and said, "I appreciate your honesty." "I appreciate yours," he said. The nights were cooling now, and she came out one morning in early November to find that he had, without being asked, winterized the water pump the way it needed to be done, wrapping the exposed pipe with cloth and banked straw against the freeze, and she stood looking at it with a feeling that was gratitude and something larger than gratitude, the recognition of being cared for by someone who notices what needs caring for before you have to ask. She told him this at breakfast. "You didn't have to do the pump," she said. "Freeze would have cracked it," he said. "I know," she said, "but you thought of it." He looked at her over his coffee with the quiet attentiveness that she had come to know was how he showed what other men showed in other ways. "Someone should think of it," he said. "That someone may as well be me." She felt the weight of the plural in that, the someone may as well be me, and she held it the way you hold something fragile and valuable. Me Dillard came that week and found them arguing cheerfully in the kitchen about the relative merits of sourdough versus regular cornbread, which was the kind of argument that only happens between people who are genuinely comfortable with each other. And Me went home and told her husband that Charlotte Cooper was going to be all right, which was the first time she had been certain of this since the previous winter. November went on, and the Texas sky turned the deep clear blue of the cool months, and the work of the property shifted to winter preparation. Lewis was thorough and knowledgeable about it, having wintered cattle in Missouri and New Mexico both, and Charlotte found that she deferred to his judgment on the animal side, and he deferred to hers on the domestic and organizational side, And the natural complementarity of this was satisfying in the particular way that partnership is satisfying when both people are actually suited to each other. He kissed her for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in mid-November when they were bringing in the last of the kitchen garden before a hard frost was expected. And it happened the way things happen when they have been approaching for a long time, not suddenly, but with the feeling of inevitability, as if the thing had always been there, and what had happened was not its arrival, but simply the moment of acknowledgement. She had been carrying a basket of late turnips, and he had been beside her carrying the remainder of the dried herbs she'd tied to the fence post in September, and she had said something. She could not later remember what exactly, something about the frost coming faster than she'd expected, and he had put his hand on her arm to stop her walking, and she had turned, and he was very close, and his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was looking at her specifically. And he said her name in a particular way that was different from any of the other times he had said it. "Charlotte," he said, and she said, "Yes," which was an answer to a question he had not yet asked but had entirely asked. He kissed her gently and without haste, and it was the kind of kiss that a person who has been careful with the world for a long time gives when he is being careful with something that matters. And she kissed him back with all the tenderness and grief and hope and willingness that had been gathering in her since the morning she made 2 plates of food and stood still in her kitchen and understood that she was not done living yet. They stood in the cold kitchen garden with the frost coming, and neither of them said a word for a long moment, and then she laughed softly, which surprised her, and he looked at her with the thing at the corner of his mouth that was his version of a full smile, and she said, "Well," and he said, "Yes," and they carried the vegetables inside. That evening, he moved his bedroll from the barn into the small room at the back of the house that had previously been a storage room, and that she had quietly cleared out over the past 2 weeks without explaining why to herself with any precision. There was propriety to consider in a small town like Redemption Creek, and they were both aware of it, and they handled it with the same matter-of-fact honesty they handled everything. She told me Dillard the next Tuesday that Lewis was staying in the house, and me, who was a woman of the world despite appearing to be a woman of Redemption Creek, nodded and said good, and that was more or less that. The harder conversation came in December, when Elias Crawford's deputy came out with a second inquiry from the Fort Worth Land Acquisition Company, this one more formal and with figures that were still low but slightly more reasonable, and Charlotte looked at it and then looked at Lewis across the kitchen table and said, "They're not going to stop." "No," Lewis agreed. "They generally don't. I need this place to work hard enough to be clearly worth keeping," she said. "More cattle than I've been running. Better market access, maybe a contract with one of the drives. Abilene's getting crowded," Lewis said, "but Wichita's still solid. You've got enough pasture with the south section if we get it properly cleared to run a significantly larger herd, say 40 head by spring, with a good bull." Charlotte looked at the papers in front of her and then at the property she could see through the kitchen window, still and beautiful in the early winter light. "Can we do it?" she asked. "I think we can," he said. The "we" landed between them with all its implications, and she did not address the implications directly, because she felt the word between them was doing its own work. They rode to Abilene in December, which was a hard 2-day ride but necessary. The cattle market and the banking connections she needed to establish for a spring purchase were both there. It was the first time she had left the property overnight since Thomas died, and she felt the significance of it physically, some tightness in her chest releasing as the property disappeared behind the hill. They rode side by side and talked the whole way, which was the nature of long rides together. The rhythm of the horses and the open land, and the absence of any other obligation pulls things out of people that they might not otherwise get around to saying. He told her about the railroad survey work he had done and why he'd quit it, and she was glad to hear him talk about injustice with the quiet clarity he brought to it, the Apache lands being cut through without consultation, the smaller ranchers being pushed off their sections to make room for the easements, the way the big money moved across the land like weather, and the people in the way of it had no more say than the grass did. He was not political about it in a theatrical way, but he was clear, and she respected that clarity. My grandfather's farm in Tennessee was taken for a railroad easement when I was 12, she said. He was compensated at a fraction of what it was worth, and he never recovered from it. He died 2 years later. That's a particular kind of stealing that wears legal clothes, Lewis said. Yes, she said. It is exactly that. They arrived in Abilene in the evening of the first day and stayed at separate lodging as was proper, she at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Feld, he at the working man's hotel down the street. They had supper together in the hotel dining room, which was perfectly respectable, and Charlotte wore the blue dress she had brought specifically because it was good quality, and she had a meeting with the bank manager the following morning, and she wanted to walk in looking like a person who owned what she owned. Lewis looked at her in the blue dress with an expression that was briefly, quietly unguarded, and she felt it in a way that was not vanity, but rather a specific and located warmth. The bank meeting went well. She met with a man named Holbrook, who was the kind of banker who gives women slightly less of his attention than the situation warrants until they demonstrate command of the numbers, at which point he pivots to full engagement, which is a common enough type. Charlotte demonstrated command of the numbers within the first 5 minutes, and by the end of the meeting she had established a credit arrangement for the spring cattle purchase and a letter of introduction to a cattle buyer in Wichita named Havorson, who was known for fair dealing. Lewis met her outside the bank and she reported the outcome, and he listened with the focused attention of someone who has a stake in the outcome, which he did. "Well done," he said, and meant it. "You doubted," she said with a slight arch of her brow. "Not for a second," he said. They rode home the next day in good weather, and the conversation covered everything from the spring planning to the particular theological questions Charlotte had been turning over since Thomas died, not crisis of faith, but the specific practical questions about what you believe when the thing you've prayed for doesn't happen and life asks you to carry on regardless. Lewis engaged with this with the same thoughtful seriousness he engaged with everything, and she found that his views were not her views in all particulars, but that the way he held his views was compatible with the way she held hers, which matters more in a shared life than the views themselves. They arrived home at dusk, and the property came over the hill in the last light, and she looked at it, and felt it pull in her chest in the way home pulls. She fixed supper and they ate, and afterward he helped her clear the dishes, which he had taken to doing as a matter of course. And when she turned from the wash basin, he was very close, and she leaned into him in a way that she had not planned but that felt entirely right, and he put his arms around her in the straightforward, solid way of a man who intends the gesture to mean what it means, and she stood in the circle of his arms for a long moment in the kitchen lamplight, and thought about how strange life is in its workings, and how the things it takes it sometimes, in its own time and its own way, gives back in a different form that you did not know you were waiting for. December settled the land into the particular suspended quiet of a Texas winter, which is not the hard white silence of a northern winter, but something drier and colder in the shadows and warmer in the sun, with frost in the mornings and afternoon light that slants sharp and gold across the grass. They work the property with the shared industry of people who understand each other's rhythms, and in the evenings they read, which Lewis did with the appetite of a man who had never had quite enough books available but who had always wanted them. She had a modest collection, mostly from Tennessee, some poetry, a few practical volumes, a Bible her mother had given her, several novels including a copy of David Copperfield that he picked up one evening and did not put down until it was done. 3 evenings later, she watched him read with the lamp bent close and the quiet of the winter around them, and she felt a happiness that was not the same as the happiness she had had with Thomas, because you cannot feel the same thing twice with different people. but it was equal to it in weight, and perhaps different in quality, more considered, more chosen, arrived at through more difficult country, and therefore carrying the specific value of things that have been hard won. "You know," he said one evening, setting down a book, "I have been in 42 towns in the 14 years since I left Missouri." "I didn't know the number was that precise," she said. "I counted once," he said. "On a long night somewhere in New Mexico. 42 towns and not one of them," he stopped. "Not one of them what?" she said. He looked at her with the full, unhurried directness she had come to love in him. "Felt like I was supposed to be there," he said. "Until here." She set down her own book. "Lewis," she said. "I know I've not been here long," he said. "I know that Thomas has been gone barely a year, and I am not asking you to—" "Lewis," she said again, more firmly. He stopped. "Ask me," she said. He was very still for a moment, and then he said, "Will you marry me, Charlotte?" She looked at him for a moment, long enough to let the question sit in the room and be real, to let the weight of what it meant sit between them fully acknowledged. She thought of Thomas, and she said goodbye to him in her heart in the specific and gentle way she had been learning to say goodbye to him, with gratitude and love and the acknowledgement that he would want her to be happy, because he had been a man who wanted her to be happy. "Yes," she said. He let out a long breath as if he had been holding it without knowing, and she crossed the room and sat beside him on the narrow settee, and he took her hand in both of his, which were calloused and strong and warm, and they sat together in the lamplight with the winter outside the window and the fire in the stove and the quiet of the property around them, and everything between them settled and clear. They were married in January of 1874, in Redemption Creek's small white church, by Pastor David Hale, who had a tendency toward long sermons, but who managed to keep it to a reasonable length when he could see that the people before him were already very sure of each other, and in no need of extended persuasion about the seriousness of the commitment. Me Dillard stood with Charlotte and an old associate of Lewis's from the cattle driving days named Robert Keene, who happened to be passing through on a drive and was delighted to be asked, stood with Lewis. Elias Crawford attended and sat in the third pew and dabbed his eyes, which surprised everyone who knew him, though perhaps should not have. Charlotte wore a dress she had made from fabric me had helped her select, a soft wool in the color of pale sage, and she wore her dark hair pinned up with the silver combs that had been her mother's. Lewis wore a new shirt and a dark coat he had purchased in Abilene, and had his boots properly blacked for the occasion, and he stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who is exactly where he intended to be and is fully aware of it. When she walked down the aisle, he watched her come with an expression that was not theater and not performance but simply feeling, clear and undisguised, and she walked toward it the way you walk toward a fire when you have been cold, with relief and gratitude and the specific gladness of the already warm. The ceremony was brief, and the vows were said with the weight that two people who have thought carefully about what they mean give them. And when it was done, the small congregation of Redemption Creek offered the cheerful noise of a community genuinely glad for the occasion. Me had organized a supper at her house, which was large enough for the purpose, and Charlotte sat at the head of the table with Lewis beside her and felt the wholeness of it, the community around her, the man beside her, the life opening ahead of her, and beneath it all the steady, honored presence of what had come before, not erased but acknowledged and loved and set, carefully and with gratitude in its proper place. They rode home in the January dark, and the stars were extraordinary, the way they always are in Texas far from town, and he drove the wagon with one hand and had the other around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side with the total ease of a woman who has come home, and neither of them said anything for a long while because nothing needed to be said. When they came over the hill and the property came into view, the dark shape of the house and the barn against the vast sky, she felt it as she always did, the pull of it, the belonging, but now she felt it doubled, as if having someone beside her to see it had increased its reality. "Our place," Lewis said quietly. "Our place," she agreed. The spring came in the way Texas springs do, fast and extravagant, with the hills going green in what felt like overnight and the creek running clear, and the whole landscape renewing itself with the decisive vigor of a country that does not do things by half measures. They had purchased 38 head of cattle in February, using the credit arrangement Charlotte had established in Abilene, including a sound young bull from a reputable operation north of Wichita, and the spring pasture work was in full execution. Lewis handling the bulk of the cattle work, and Charlotte managing the records and the market correspondence with the efficiency and precision that Elias Crawford, who had agreed to handle their legal matters, had come to openly admire. The inquiry from the Fort Worth Land Company came one final time in March, more formal than the previous ones, and Charlotte wrote back a response on the headed paper she had ordered from the printer in Abilene that said Cooper Rhodes Ranch in good clear type at the top, and the response she wrote was polite and firm and final, and the inquiry stopped. "Do you think they'll actually stop?" Lewis asked when she told him. "They'll find easier targets," she said. "We've made it clear we're not one." He looked at the spring pasture, where the new cattle were grazing in the long morning light, and nodded with satisfaction. The letter from Robert Keene arrived in April, which Robert was in the habit of sending because he was a naturally communicative man, and it mentioned in passing that there was a fine cattle buyer in Wichita named Havorson who was looking for committed suppliers for the fall market, and Charlotte already had Havorson's contact from the Abilene Bank meeting, and the combination of these two connections resulted in a contract for 30 head at a price that was, as Lewis put it when she showed him the letter, enough to make the spring's work feel like it had already been worth it. She caught him looking at the contract with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was not quite disbelief and not quite relief but partook of both, the expression of a man who has not been accustomed to things working out and is recalibrating his expectations of the world. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He looked up. "I am thinking," he said slowly, "that I have spent a great deal of years being good at things without having anything I was good at those things for." She understood exactly what he meant. "And now," she said, "now I know what I'm doing it for," he said. She kissed him there in the kitchen over the cattle contract, which was not the most romantic setting but was, in its practical way, exactly right. The summer of 1874 was a working summer, hot and demanding, the cattle requiring constant management in the heat, the south pasture clearing work going on in the early mornings before the temperature climbed, the correspondence with Havorson and the Wichita market ongoing. They worked alongside each other in the long days and came in at dusk and ate and talked and read, and went to bed in the way of people who are genuinely tired in a way that is also genuinely satisfying, the exhaustion of productive days that belong to you and to something you are building. Me Dillard came in June and found Charlotte in the garden with an expression that me had not seen before, which was a kind of private interior illumination that some women carry for a certain period of time, and which me recognized immediately. "Charlotte," she said. Charlotte looked up. Me raised her eyebrows in a question she was too tactful to ask aloud. "Early April, I think," Charlotte said quietly. Me sat down on the porch step and put her hand over her mouth and then removed it and said, "Oh, sweetheart," in a voice that contained 40 different things, all of them kind. Charlotte told Lewis that evening. She had been trying to find the right moment for 3 days, which was its own kind of happiness, the anticipation of it, and she told him simply over supper. She had not made an occasion of it because an occasion felt like it might make him feel that a particular kind of reaction was required, and she wanted his genuine one. He put down his fork. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen before and could not entirely read, which was unusual because she had become adept at reading him, and then she realized what was in the expression. It was a man being caught by something larger than he expected, a feeling that arrived at the full size of itself before he had time to prepare for it. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes," she said. He got up from the table and came around and took both her hands in his, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I had stopped thinking this would be my life." "What kind of life?" she said. "This kind," he said simply. "A home, a woman I love more than I have words for." And now a child," she said. He pulled her into him carefully, as if she might be fragile, which she was not and would need to tell him at some point, though it was a tenderness she did not mind at the moment. She rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, which was steady, and felt the warmth and solidity of him and thought of the winter morning with the 2 plates and the long stillness, and she understood now what that moment had been. It had not been grief reaching its end. It had been a door standing open, and she had been standing on the threshold, not yet knowing who or what was on the other side, not knowing whether she had the courage to step through. She had stepped through, and here was what was on the other side. The fall of 1874 brought the cattle drive to Wichita, which Lewis managed with Robert Keene's help, Keene having agreed to come on for the drive, and the 30 head went at the contracted price, and the financial position of the Cooper Rhodes ranch improved significantly. Charlotte managed the home side in Lewis's 10-day absence with the capable steadiness that had gotten her through the previous year's solo operation, and when he rode back in on a cool October evening, she met him on the porch, and he was trail-dusty and tired, and the first thing he did upon dismounting was put his hand gently on her rounded abdomen, and look at her with the particular tender attentiveness of a man checking on the most important thing. "All well," she said. "All well," he repeated, as if confirming it to himself. They sat on the porch that evening with hot coffee, and she told him everything that had happened with the property while he was gone, the fence repair she had managed, the winterizing she had started, the neighbor dispute over the east water access that she had resolved with the neighboring Morales family through a straightforward conversation and a modest adjustment to the fence line, and he listened with the full attention he always gave her, and then he said, "You didn't need me here." "No," she agreed. "But I wanted you here, which is different and better." He smiled at that, a full smile, which he reserved for moments that earned it, and it transformed his face into something younger and entirely unguarded, and she loved him so specifically in that moment that she felt it like a physical thing. Their son was born on the 14th of January, 1875, exactly 1 year and 4 days after Charlotte and Lewis were married, which Me Dillard said was good symmetry, and Elias Crawford said was auspicious, and Lewis said, holding the small, wrinkled, emphatically loud person in his large, careful hands, was everything. They named him Daniel Thomas Rhodes Daniel for Lewis's paternal grandfather, whose name carried more goodness than the man who had passed it to Lewis's father, and Thomas for Thomas Cooper, because Charlotte wanted her first husband's name to be in the world in a living way, and Lewis had agreed with the specific, quiet generosity that was characteristic of him in things that mattered. Me Dillard held Daniel the day after he was born and said he had Charlotte's eyes, which he did, that shifting gray-green that changes with the light, and Lewis's jaw, which he also did, a sturdiness apparent even in an infant. And Charlotte lay in the large bed she and Lewis shared, and looked at her husband holding their son with an expression she could not describe, except that it involved every good thing she had accumulated in 32 years of living, and the additional force of having nearly stopped accumulating good things and having chosen not to. The winter of 1875 was a working one, which all winters are when you have a cattle operation and a new child, and the property absorbed the additional complexity of infant life with the sturdy indifference of a place that has been home to more than one chapter. Charlotte managed the recovery from childbirth with the same practical competence she brought to everything, and Lewis took over the morning water pump and the feeding without being asked, and the natural adjustment of two people who function well together to a significantly changed set of circumstances went as well as it could go, which is to say it was hard and exhausting and occasionally fraying at the edges, but fundamentally, unshakably, all right. Daniel grew with the vigorous enthusiasm of a child born to people who wanted him very much. And by summer, he was large enough to be carried on the property rounds that Charlotte resumed once she was fully recovered, bundled against her in a sling of her own construction while she did the garden and the lighter fence walking. Lewis took him in the evenings on the porch, this absurdly small person against the large, quiet landscape, and they sat together and watched the light change on the hills, and Lewis talked to him in the low, unhurried voice that had always been Lewis's natural register, explaining the horses or the fence line or the particular behavior of clouds on the horizon, in the way of a man who had always understood that children deserve to be spoken to as people. By the fall of 1875, the Cooper Rhodes Ranch had 30 head of breeding cattle, a contract with Hadnt for the next 2 seasons, a fully sound barn and fence line, a winter-prepped water system, and a specific reputation in Redemption Creek as a well-run operation that was not going anywhere. The Fort Worth Land Company had not been heard from in 6 months. Elias Crawford had handled a minor legal matter regarding the water access on the east border that secured the Rhodes' claim to the creek water through a properly filed document, which put the matter beyond future dispute. Dillard came on a Tuesday in October and found Charlotte at the kitchen table with Daniel on one hip doing the books for the ranch with the other hand, and she said, with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has watched something she hoped for come fully into being, "You are disgustingly happy." Charlotte looked up. "I am," she agreed, "fully and unashamedly so." "Good," me said, and sat down for coffee. Lewis came in from the pasture at noon, Daniel immediately reaching for him with the single-minded urgency of a 10-month-old who has identified his favorite person, and Lewis took him and set him on his hip and ate his lunch one-handed, and the absolute ordinary completeness of it made Charlotte set down her own fork for a moment just to look at it. "What?" Lewis said. "Nothing," she said. "Everything. Both." He looked at her with the expression she loved most, the full attention, the slight gathering at the brows, the thing at the corner of his mouth. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I have never," she said honestly, "been more all right in my life." He looked at her for a moment, and the expression settled into something warm and certain. "Good," he said. It was on a Thursday morning in November of 1875 that it happened again. Charlotte was in the kitchen before dawn. The season had turned fully cold, and the early morning hours were dark and sharp, and she started the fire in the stove and drew the water and began to make breakfast as she always did, moving through the motions of it with the comfortable automatic fluency of something done thousands of times, the body knowing the kitchen by heart. And she set 2 plates, as she always did, as she had done every morning for nearly 2 years now with Lewis in the house and at the table. She stood back and looked at the 2 plates, and the thought arrived, the memory of another morning 2 years ago now, when she had stood looking at 2 plates and felt a different thing entirely. The grief of the first morning, the vast stillness of it, the 2 plates standing for everything that was absent. And now the 2 plates stood for everything that was present. She stood still for a long moment, as she had stood still that first morning, but the stillness was different in every way. It was not the stillness of a woman stopped by loss. It was the stillness of a woman moved by gratitude. And she felt in that stillness the full arc of the 2 years Thomas and the grief of him, the long winter she had carried alone, the morning she had made 2 plates without thinking and stood still and understood something about herself, the Thursday a stranger had ridden in from the west on a roan horse and taken off his hat politely, the fence line and the barn roof and the stock tank, the conversation on the high point of the property, the peach pie, the October wind and the caught hat, the first kiss in the cold garden, the wedding in January, the contract with Hadnt, Daniel's first loud breath in the lamplight, Lewis's hand on her face when he said she was tougher than she thought she was, Lewis's voice saying this is good land, Lewis saying he had stopped thinking this would be his life. She heard him behind her, the particular sound of his step, which she knew by now the way you know a sound that belongs in your house, and she heard him pause. 2 plates, he said softly. 2 plates, she said. He came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and they stood together looking at the table set for 2 in the lamplight, with the dark morning outside the window and the sleeping child in the back room, and the property around them full of everything they had built. "Thomas," she said quietly. "I know," he said. It was not awkward. It was honest, which was what they always were with each other, and he held her a little more firmly in the acknowledgement of it, and she felt the particular wholeness of being held by someone who does not ask you to be less than everything you are, grief and love and history and all. "I loved him," she said. "And I love you, and both of those things are true at the same time and always will be." "I know," he said, "and I am glad you did. He was a good man to love you well enough that you know how to be loved." She turned then and looked at him in the lamplight, this man who had ridden in from the west on a tired horse and fixed her fence and her barn, and without exactly meaning to, the specific broken place in her life that she had begun to think might not be fixable. "Lewis Rhodes," she said. "Charlotte Rhodes," he said, which was the first time either of them had used her married name in everyday speech, not in a document or a formal context, but simply and directly and fully, and the weight of it landed in her chest warm and sure and permanent. Daniel woke and announced this fact with his characteristic vigor from the back room, and Lewis went to get him while Charlotte finished the breakfast, and they ate together in the lamplit kitchen, with the infant banging a spoon on the table, with the joyful lack of rhythm of someone who has discovered percussion, and cannot see why everyone is not as pleased about it as he is. Spring came again. The second spring on the ranch was different from the first in the way that the second year of anything built together is different from the first. The foundation already set, the panic of the new replaced by the confidence of the known. They expanded the herd to 52 head and added 2 horses, one of which was a young gray mare that Lewis bought from a horse trader passing through, and brought home with the particular quiet enthusiasm of a man who has found something genuinely excellent. Charlotte named her Sage because she had the color of it, and Lewis allowed this with good grace. The Wichita drive in the fall of 1876 went better than the first, and the letter from Havorson in December confirmed a 3rd season's contract at an improved rate, and Charlotte sat with the letter at the kitchen table and looked at the ranch ledger and then looked up at Lewis and said, "We are doing this." "We are," he agreed. "I mean really doing it," she said. "It's not fragile anymore." He looked at her steadily. "It was never as fragile as you thought it was," he said. "Even at the beginning, you were never as close to the edge as it felt." "I know that now," she said, "but it's different to know it than to feel it. And now you feel it." She looked around the kitchen, at the ledger, at the herbs drying at the window, at Daniel's small boots by the door, at Lewis sitting across from her, the way Lewis had sat across from her at this table for 2 years, steady and present and entirely, unequivocally there. "Now I feel it," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it for a moment in the simple, full way that only people who have been through things together hold each other's hands. In the spring of 1877, Charlotte discovered she was expecting their second child, which came with a particular kind of joy that is different from the first, not less, but seasoned, the way a second season of something you love is seasoned by knowing what it takes and being glad to take it. Daniel was 2 years old and opinions about everything and entirely convinced that the world was arranged for his specific benefit, which Charlotte and Lewis found exhausting and completely wonderful in equal measure. Dillard came when Charlotte told her and said, "Again," with an expression that was entirely delighted. "Again," Charlotte confirmed. Their daughter was born in October of 1877, which meant she arrived exactly as the fall light was doing its particular Texas gold across the hills, and Lewis held her in his hands that were large and careful in the way they always were with small things, and his expression was the one Charlotte had come to know, that caught, unguarded feeling too big for his usual self-containment. And he said her name, which was Anna Margaret Rhodes. For Lewis's mother Margaret, whom he had loved and missed all the intervening years, and Charlotte had offered this naming, and he had accepted it with the specific and total gratitude of a man given back something he thought he'd lost. Daniel was brought in to meet his sister and regarded her with the deep suspicion of a toddler confronted with a rival, which settled over the following days into a fascinated ownership that would remain, Charlotte predicted, the dominant mode of their sibling relationship for at least the next decade. The winter of 1877 was mild compared to the winter that had taken Thomas, which Charlotte noted without saying, holding Anna in the lamplight in the evenings while Daniel slept and Lewis read at the table across from her, the stove warm and the house full of the specific density of a life that is fully lived in. Elias Crawford came to the house in December with some documents to be signed and stayed for coffee and sat in the kitchen looking around at the evidence of the life assembled there and said, with the directness of an old man who has earned the right to it, Thomas Cooper was a good man and he would be pleased. Charlotte looked at him steadily. I know he would, she said. I keep him here, she touched her chest briefly, and he is glad for me. Elias nodded and did not say anything more about it and finished his coffee and thanked her for the biscuits, which were excellent. Lewis walked him to his horse and came back inside and found Charlotte at the table with the documents and Anna asleep on the chair beside her in the little padded nest they had made from folded blankets, and he sat down across from her and looked at her with the full and unguarded love that he had stopped trying to contain into small expressions some months ago, wearing it now plainly, the way a man wears something he is proud of. What was Elias saying about Thomas, he asked, not jealously, simply curious. That Thomas would be pleased, she said. Lewis nodded. He would be, Charlotte said. He was a man who loved me well, and a man who loves someone well wants their life to be full. Lewis was quiet for a moment. I am glad, he said. Every day, I need you to know that. I know it, she said. I am glad for you and for Daniel and for Anna and for this place, and for every morning I get to be the person who wakes up here, he said. It came out slightly more than he usually gave at once, and he acknowledged this with a brief look of mild surprise at himself that was entirely characteristic. She smiled at him, the full smile she had begun to give freely, having learned that life is not improved by holding back the full smile. Lewis, she said, yes. I am glad every day, too. He reached across the table, and she gave him her hand, and he held it, and they sat in the kitchen with the winter outside and the two children sleeping and the good steady warmth of the stove and the good steady fact of each other. And the story of it, how it had begun, how it had been, how it had arrived here was present between them, unspoken but entire, like the land outside the window that goes all the way to the horizon and then keeps going, past what you can see, into everything that is still to come. There were ordinary days after that, which are the best kind of days when you are lucky enough to have them. The days made of coffee and horses and fence lines and children's laughter and suppers and evening conversations, and sleep in a warm bed beside a person you love. There were harder days, too, because the land and the life do not arrange themselves for comfort exclusively. The drought year of 1879 that they rode out with careful management and the Havorson contract holding. The broken leg Lewis sustained in 1880 when a new horse he was working spooked badly, which kept him off the cattle work for 6 weeks, and during which Charlotte managed the full operation with the thoroughness and competence that Lewis had always known was there, and that he lay in the bed watching, and told her every day was extraordinary, which she received with the practical modesty of a woman who knows her own capabilities and does not need to be surprised by them. There was the day Daniel at 5 fell in the creek, and Charlotte pulled him out and held him on the bank shaking, and her heart went so fast she thought it might come out of her, and Lewis arrived at a run from the south pasture and held them both. There was the letter from Robert Keene that came in 1881 telling them he had married a woman in Kansas and settled there, which felt like a closing chapter of the life Lewis had lived before, and he read it at the table with quiet satisfaction and wrote back a warm reply. Daniel grew into a boy who had his mother's precision and his father's patience, and who showed from a young age the same quality of complete attention that Lewis brought to things, which Charlotte noticed with a specific and tender pride. Anna grew into a girl who had her father's steadiness and her mother's determination, and who had additionally the particular vivid quality of a person who makes a room more present, which was not from either of her parents and was simply her own. They were a family, which is to say they were complicated and imperfect and deeply known to each other, and they were a ranch, which is to say they were rooted in something real and demanding and beautiful, and they were in Redemption Creek, which in 1882 had grown enough to have a second church and a newspaper and a school that Daniel attended, and Anna would attend in 2 years, and which had become, despite its original quality of a place people ended up in while looking for somewhere else. A place that people had chosen. Charlotte had chosen it, and then had chosen it again, and then had chosen it a third time when she might have left and did not. On the morning of her 39th birthday, in August of 1882, she woke before Lewis and went to the kitchen and started the fire and drew the water and began to make breakfast. And she set the table for 4 because there were 4 of them now, 4 plates, and the kitchen was full of morning light, and the smell of coffee, and the sound of the property starting up around her. She stood for a moment looking at the 4 plates on the table and thought of the 2 plates of that morning 9 years ago, and she thought of the long stillness, and she thought of everything that had happened in the distance between that stillness and this one. Lewis came in behind her. She heard his step. She would always know his step, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her looking at the table. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She turned and looked at him, at this man who had ridden in from the west on a tired horse and become, without ceremony and without fanfare, the other half of everything. "I am thinking," she said, "about a morning a long time ago when I made 2 plates of food without thinking and stood still for a long time because there was only one of me." He came into the kitchen and stood beside her, and they looked at the 4-plate table together. "And now," he said. "And now," she said, "there are 4 plates and there is not enough room at this table, and I would not change a single thing." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Daniel came thundering in from the back of the house with his boots unlaced, and Anna behind him in her nightgown with her hair uncombed, and the kitchen filled up with the noise of children and mourning, and the particular loud ordinary music of a full life. Lewis looked at her over the tops of the children's heads with the expression she had loved since the beginning, the full attention, the warmth that he wore openly now, the entire quiet and certain gladness of a man who has found the place, and the person he was looking for through 42 towns and several hundred miles of open country. She looked back at him with all of it, the grief she had carried and the love she had built and the woman she had been and the woman she was, the 2 plates and the 4 plates and every morning in between. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. And the sun came up over the Texas hills the way it did every morning, enormous and golden, burning off the night in a wide and certain blaze, and the day opened ahead of them the way all their days did now, full and demanding, and theirs, entirely and at last and finally theirs, all the way to the wide horizon and past it, into everything that was still to come.